The closest equivalent of the hypershade that can be found within Blender is the properties window that we can see over here. We've got these two icons at the top. We've got this sphere icon, which basically denotes our materials, and we've got this checkerboard, which denotes our textures. There's not a lot of information in here, as you can tell, just because we've not got any textures or materials assigned to this cube at the moment. This is basically dependent on what item you might have selected at the time, so it's not that similar in terms of the hypershade where it's going to show all our materials in one go. In fact, all our materials are actually we can browse the material in here, so we can see any materials that happen to be available can be seen within here now. We can see all these say 0. Basically all of these are not assigned to anything. In fact, this material.002 is the only thing it thinks that something's assigned to it potentially in the scene somewhere. But if we were to click on new now, we could see that we get a lot more information, the sort of things that might show up in the attribute editor of Maya. Same kind of idea here in the texture settings. We've got this clouds procedural texture that it gives us by default, but we can click on the type there and we get this list of other options. If I just switch back over to the material tab of the properties window though. So as we can see all these various different settings, here we get a little bit of a preview there as to what we should be expecting once we render. That just takes me to basically being able to display what's going on in the viewport a little bit better. We can probably want to, we probably want to switch to the viewport shading to texture. So if we just switch that now, that gives us our lighting information, so we can the shadow information, so we can move that over there. We can see we're kind of getting a bit of light coming over in that way. Another thing that we can do here, just to enhance what's going on, is to press the N to bring up this properties sidebar, and we can switch in the display settings here. We can switch the shading to GLSL. So that'll just give us the best chance of being able to visualize the normal, specular, things like that in the viewport. Also, for most graphics cards, that should be speeding up the performance within the 3D view as well. So that's something to bear in mind. If we want to just switch back to a non-textured view, we can just use the solid shading mode in that, which is we can toggle on and off with the Alt-Z shortcut key. We can switch between textured and just solid mode, and then just the Z key to switch between solid mode and the wireframe. So that's just something to point out there. You'll notice that we've got this clouds texture, and we can see from the preview that this is not what's happening in here. If I just press Alt-Z to switch to the textured mode. But if I press Control Alt and 0 just to frame the camera at the current location of the viewing camera that we had there, and then press F12 to render, we can see we do get that kind of shader. In fact, if I switch that to a cube rendering type preview, we can see that that is pretty much almost exactly what we get, except the fact that we're getting this shading here because of the single light that we have in the scene on the opposite side of the room there. So the problem here, to just highlight, is the fact that we're not getting any procedural texture visualization within the viewport. Also, the other big point to mention is the fact that this is the Blender's internal engine. We can see here at the top it says Blender Render. This is where we would switch to different engines. We could potentially have a longer list here depending on the other rendering engines that you might have, but the Blender render is generally referred to as the internal render, so this is akin to the Maya software hardware kind of rendering. There's also this cycles render, which is kind of equivalent to the mental ray that you would get within Maya. It's not quite the same, of course, but if we were to switch over to this, you'll see that we get now some different or additional options here in the viewport shading. We can actually switch it to a rendered view, so we do actually get a real-time actually what's happening. First, I'm just going to mention just one other way in which we can manipulate the materials within Blender, within both engines, the cycles and the internal, is by using the nodal system, which is kind of similar to the hypergraph or the work area of the hypershade. So if I actually just left click and drag down just to split this view, and then I'm going to switch the bottom one to a node editor. Apologize that it's obviously getting quite cramped in here, so just pull that over a little bit. If I just click on use nodes, this is going to essentially take on an appearance that you might be familiar with the Hypershade, the workspace area, because we've got this diffuse basically being plugged into the output of the surface in this instance, in this from that node, this green node to that green node, simply put. We've got still maintain some information in here, which we can still, which is kind of many of the same details that we'll get in here. We can click on add here, for example, and we get the textures here, or I can go Shift A to bring up the shortcut there, same kind of menu. And we can go to texture and then go to a checker texture, for example. Now what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to left click on this color node there and just plug that into the color of this diffuse, and we can see we do get that. In fact, let's just change the color of that one of these to the yellow, and then we can see that we're actually getting essentially a very typical view that you might be familiar with from within Maya. But the key thing here to note is that we are actually getting the updated view there. If we were to switch the material though, we'll lose that information. We do need to see that in the rendered mode. And if this was to be plugged into a transparent material, again, we'll get all that information in the viewport there. And in fact, if I was to render that, it'll render from the camera in the scene, but the shader should look extremely similar, which it does. So I'm just going to escape out that window. So I'm just going to switch back to this default rendering engine that we got, and then actually just I'm just going to left click in the top right corner here and just move up into the screen above to just collapse that view, and then switch it back to the properties. So we can see there, I'm just going to, these two icons here, this is showing that we're actually using the nodes. So I'm just going to uncheck that just to come back to this main kind of properties panel view that we get here. This properties window view of the materials. Basically, really, I just want to concentrate on this top bit here, just to show some duplicated features from within the Hypershade. One of the main things in the Hypershade is obviously you get an entire list of all the shaders in the scene. Where we would find this is just in this list here. So these are all the shaders that happen to be in the scene at the moment. In fact, all the ones with the 0 are not assigned to anything. So if we close down Blender and reopen them, we won't get these anymore, which we would need to do in the Hypershade of Maya. We would need to clear all the unused nodes, but we would just these are always going to be here until we reopen Blender. This one with an F is essentially just this. If I just switch to that material now, we can see that the F is actually pressed down. This just basically means that if we were to close down Blender and then reopen it, we'll save them. We'll save it. We won't lose this data block anymore, this particular material. So if we just switch back to that cube material now, we can see we can switch between the materials that way, the materials that happens to be assigned. There's something else that we can do, which is to, for example, if we wanted to duplicate this object, it's actually, we can see now we get this number 2 here because 2 objects are using that material. If we wanted to use this material and we had a lot of settings that we changed and we wanted to just duplicate the shading network as it would be termed in Maya, one of the ways in which we would do that is just click on this number 2 now, and then that would just duplicate that material and just give it a 001 at the end, and now we can carry on manipulating that without fear of altering the other material, which we can see there is still preserved. Something else that we can do is if I just tab into edit mode, we can see here that if I just go Control Tab to bring up our mesh select and just click on face, I'm just going to select this top face there and then click assign. Nothing's going to happen because that shader is assigned to all the faces of that at the moment. But if we were to just click on the plus icon here, and I'm just going to look for another material in here that's already created, for example. So for example, this material here, that's going to get saved if we were to close. Let's just change the color to something like the blue over there. And now what I can do is just assign, click on this assign button, and now we can see that the top face has that shader assigned to it now. So that's basically how you would assign it to different faces in a particular mesh. But that's basically at an edit level, so we need to tab into edit level to be able to have that take effect. If I press A to just deselect everything, if we want to click on this material, the top material, and then click select, it will select all the faces that happen to have that selected, that applied to. Again, another limitation of Blender is the fact that it works on an object by object level. So if I wanted to select all the objects in the scene that happen to have this material, we wouldn't be able to do that. It would have to be a material by material setting. So that's a limitation there. There might be a way to script around that, but personally not that familiar with how you would do that. I realise this is just quite an overview, and there's obviously millions of other features and things like that within here, especially between Blender and the Cycles rendering engines. But this is just to serve as a basic overview of getting started on materials. Same kind of thing applies with these textures here. Just have a route around. We'll be shortly getting to some proper projects, and we'll see exactly how we're setting up the shaders for particular purposes. So this is just serving as a particular overview for now. So let's just crack on with the other equivalents. So the hypergraph in Maya allows us to take an alternate view at the parent and child relationships throughout a scene, which is a kind of top-down bird's eye view at the data behind what's happening. We can also look at the input and output connections of the objects, which are things like textures connected to materials and mesh construction operations and how they link to one another, and how overall they might relate to other objects. We can also then reorganize how this information is displayed to help with visualizing and dealing with that information at a glance, which definitely comes into its own in more complicated scenes. Blender unfortunately doesn't really have a direct equivalent of this. In fact, it doesn't even have an indirect equivalent. Mostly the best way to visualize what's happening in the scene is within the outliner, which should bring us to our next window to show the equivalent of. So Maya's outliner is essentially can be found within Blender's outliner, much of the functionality, or at least its main usage at least. You can see at the far left of each of these windows, in the headers of each, you can see the content, this little icon here. We can click on these icons just to change the contents of this window. There's a few things to note about this, which we can get a bit more of a different kind of information flow, or the way that information is being displayed here, by switching on the display type menu here and switch this to, say, data blocks, for example. If we look in here now, we can, a lot of the content of the scene is divided up into different types. So we've got materials and meshes here. So if we could just look at all the materials that happen to be in the scene at the moment, we can see that there. We can in fact get right down into the nitty-gritty of all the various different qualities of a particular, or attributes of all a particular material in this instance. So that's worth knowing, that there's different things that we can visualize within the outliner there. There's a couple of limitations in here to point out though, which is to do with there's no parent dragging to create parenting in here, although I believe that somebody has been experimenting with this, so maybe it will get into a version soon. The other thing is the fact that this is going to be alphabetical, so if you want to organize your the things in the scene there, you might need to start creating an empty node and group them all within that, or potentially keep the naming convention a particular way. So if you need everything to be in one area of the outliner, once obviously this starts to get pretty complicated, then yeah, maybe that's the way to go there. But as I say, there's other ways that we can view the information in here. So for example, we can just look at selected, or maybe in groups, or something of that sort of nature. So that's definitely worth taking a look at there. The next window to look at is the graph editor. Let's just take a quick look at the equivalent in there. In fact, I'm just going to drag these two windows up. Well, we're just going to drag this bottom window up a little bit just to get a better view at this. I'm just going to switch this. Just as I was saying about the outliner there, I can just click this icon here just to swap the contents, and we can see here we have a graph editor, which is essentially the same kind of idea. In fact, I'm just going to go back to the 3D view and just grab this object and press I to insert a keyframe. Let's do this for the location, rotation, and the scale. So we've got these have just turned yellow now, as you can see, to indicate there is a keyframe on this particular frame. In fact, we can see that this cube here has turned orange as well. So if I just go forward a frame by pressing the right arrow key, we can see that this has gone green now, to indicate there's definitely keyframes somewhere, but it's not exactly on this frame. So if we just go left again, we can see that's changed. So that's just a brief aside there. But if we now open up the graph editor, we get some more information. So you can see all that kind of thing there. Don't want to get too much into this, just point out that the window exists. We'll get into a few more things, the controls and the operations and the visualizations and the way we can organize this view and the tools and the facilities that we would actually employ here. I would do this in much more project related, so it's a little bit more specific and practical. So anyway, there's that, but there's also a window down here which we can switch to the dope sheet, which shows us again similar kind of information, just a very easy bird's eye view of the keyframes. So that's essentially brings us on to the next equivalent for the dope sheet within Maya. We would find some of that functionality here. There's the UV image editor. In fact, I'm just going to drag this back down again, just switch this to the UV/image editor, which we can find if I just, this is the image editor side of it, if you like. If I just click this X, this is more of the UV image inside, UV edit inside. So we can see, if I just press, switch that again to a 3D view. I've just left clicked the top right corner of that window and pulled out to the left just to duplicate the view. If I press, I'm just going to press U to unwrap this cube. We can see in here now, I'll just pack those UVs, which we can find here, pack islands. So basically that's the UV editor there. We've got some more tools, some more display functions that we can do within the properties there, or the tool shelf there I should say. So that's just the UV editing window. Another window that I'd like to point out unfortunately doesn't have an equivalent within Blender is the visor. The visor gives us access to a repository of frequently used meshes and effects, and much more besides, which we can then draw into the scene. Things like grasses, trees, buildings, and quite a bit more, as you may be able to tell by the general options. Within the header of each 3D view, we've got two 3D views side by side here. We've got a right orthographic and a user perspective. We can see we've got these this view menu in both. We've got view all and view selected. This is basically just frame all and frame selected. So that's where those equivalents would be in Blender. However, these aren't view all in all views and view selected in all views. However, that isn't a massive kind of disadvantage that that particular operation isn't in here, because we just repeat the shortcut keys in as long as the cursor's on each view. So if I was to press the home key now, we can see that framed all in all views, and just repeat the same move once the cursor hovers around that other viewport. So basically that's the equivalents for the various different framing in Blender.